So if you don't know, the Miles Morales game takes place 1 year after Spider-Man 1 concludes. By this point, Peter has been training Miles on what it is to be Spider-Man, on his powers, kind of how to take on some of the responsibilities. But ultimately, it's revealed that Peter's going to be leaving New York for a trip, and he's going to be leaving New York in Miles' hands. Now, at this point, Miles has to take it upon himself to understand fully what it means to be New York's web slinger himself. So, concludes the game. Now, Spider-Man Miles Morales, compared to the first one, it looks visually better, just a tad bit. And I feel like that's mostly due to the ray tracing and the higher fidelity that goes into the density of, traffic, people on the ground, foliage. All of that stuff is definitely more detailed. But then also the game runs at 60 frames per second. So not only does it look just a little bit better, it plays a hell of a lot more smoother. Now, I know, of course, we had the 60 FPS upgrade for Spider-Man 1, but the fact that Miles Morales was built from the ground up with the 60 frames per second in mind, it definitely kind of flows a little differently, right? Because it's not like you're going from 30 to 60. You're starting straight off from 60, and you go from there. But yes, I definitely like the way that Miles Morales looks. I like how the characters themselves look. It's not Insomniac is not one of them companies that need over hyper realistic, characters. But for the animation and the animation grading that they do, the characters themselves do look good. Now, we remember when Miles Morales was first revealed and my man's had like the old cut edge up, and that shit was all types of fucked up. Well, of course they fixed that shit. So my man looked nice. You know what I'm saying? He got a nice cut, nice dude. He looking good. The characters look good. The audio for the game is fantastic. Everything feels like it's alive. The city itself feels like it's alive, and they roll with it. It's just a nice transfer over, right? As far as the gameplay goes, right, it plays the same. There's no big leap in terms of how the combat plays compared to playing Spider-Man 1 versus Miles Morales, except the fact that you get a new set of skills and you get the Venom power, right? And the Venom power definitely changes up how combat flows, because now you kind of have this extra ability that is incorporated into the fights because of depending on which enemies you're fighting. So if you're fighting the undergrounders, you need to use your Venom powers to knock off a lot of their abilities and weapons that they're using. If you're fighting Roxxon, the Venom power abilities definitely help with, unequipping them from their gear and stuff. But ultimately, like, besides, the Venom power and the camouflage, the combat pretty much is rock solid the same. But it's nothing wrong with that. It's one of those things where if it ain't broke, there's no reason to fix it. The only thing you can do is just change up how the player can incorporate the new powers into the combat system that you already are accustomed to. And it definitely provides a lot of freestyle and variation with the Venom power added into the mix. Now, the camouflage ability, it doesn't really add much to what combat is, except the fact that, you can, if you're in a stealth situation, you can pretty much restart that stealth situation if you get caught. Or you can unlock a skill where if you get caught, or when you're about to get caught, it automatically activates the stealth. So besides those two powers, combat of the game feels exactly the same. Controls feel exactly the same. As far as the enemy variation and the enemies that are involved, like I said, you have the undergrounders, you have Roxxon, and then of course you have your local, Rikers Island prisoners. And, they don't have any much variation besides some, for some reason, have access to these crazy ass rocket launchers or a full ass arsenal of weapons that they just so happen to find in the back of the truck. At this point, I feel like there's somebody working from the inside out to get these Rikers prisoners everything that they need. There's no reason that this guy should have a random ass rocket launcher. It just makes no sense. Now, as far as Roxxon goes, you have to have your private military company within, like, the Spider-Man game. Of course, in the first Spider-Man game, you had Silver Sable's entire PMC company. And so, of course, you got to have a private military company for Miles to fight, right? It only makes sense. And of course, these people are owned by the big ass corporation that you're ultimately trying to take down. And then you have the Undergrounders, of course, which are kind of your I can't think of the guys from the first Spider-Man, but the mass syndicate, the guys with the hollow powers, as I like to call them. It's pretty much who the Undergrounders are. Now, they do provide some variation in terms of how you are to approach them, because with the guys, the Undergrounders who have the large fists, you can't, attack them directly because they have like an impenetrable defense via the gloves. Then you have the guys who come in with the shields and the hammers. So they're on top of having a shield. They're a heavy set guy too. So you can't approach them the same way that you would approach a shield guy from Roxxon. So there's enough variation in there to keep it mixed up. There's even some situations and crimes where you actually have to fight both at the same time. Man, it's pretty cool. As far as the boss fights go, you fight Rhino, you fight Prowler, and you fight the underground boss, of course. And within fighting those people, they all have their own move sets. They all have their own specialties, and they all have their own way of beating them. Like, I know originally with Rhino, it was just using your venom power. Then ultimately, Rhino gets employed by Roxxon. So now you have to use, your venom power on top of other means to stop him or wear him down so that you're able to beat him up. Fighting the Prowler, it wasn't a knockout, drag out fight because he would just go invisible from time to time. But it was enough variation between those bosses that it didn't feel monotonous, And then, of course, in some of those fights, you had, little people would enter, or you would just have to fight them one-on-one, but there would be like waves or phases, as they would say, where if you get them to a certain amount of health, of course you don't see, but you get them to a certain amount of health, it goes to the next phase, and then you have to fight them through a different portion, so on and so forth, right? What you come to expect from Insomniac boss fight games. Boss fight moments. As far as the skills go, like I said, you have a very vast amount of skills that actually provide enough variety to set how you want to play the game. There's no clear-cut way on how to do it, but ultimately, it's enough variety there to, for you to formulate how you want to attack a situation. Now, as far as like the game itself, the ending of the game, I think overall, man, it took me like 8 hours to complete. I think about 8 hours. I had to go back and look. I think it was about 8 hours. It wasn't that long. I feel like it ultimately could have been like some form of a DLC, just off of length and how close it is to Spider-Man 1. It would have felt like a great DLC, right? It didn't need to be its own game. And then ultimately, of course, how it ends, pretty much beat the game, Peter comes back, everything's cool, right? But as far as like the future of the game, we know that Spider-Man 2 is on the way, and we know that ultimately, Peter and Miles are going to team back up, and it seems like the big guy, of course, is going to be Venom. Now, Insomniac may pull some shit out their ass and even throw another curveball at us. But we know that so far, Venom is the big bad for the future of what Miles and Peter have to deal with in New York City. And overall, I feel like where this game cut off, it could have been some DLC. And if I was to give it like a score, right? You know, because everybody does the 1 through 10. If I was to give it a score, I'd say as far as functionality, gameplay, story, uh, getting some questions answered, you know, it was definitely it it was definitely deserving of the time. If I was to give it a score, I'd give it a 8 out of 10. And the only reason I couldn't even closely relate get this like a perfect score in any shape or form is because of how close in relation it is to Spider-Man 1. And that's not a bad thing. It's just that in terms of timing, you pretty much got what you already had got before, but with a different story, different environment, different characters, different bosses, and different ways to interact with the world. Everything was original to what it was to be Miles, but it was still within the same scope of what it was to be Spider-Man and what you did in Spider-Man 1. So I would definitely give it an 8 out of 10. Feel like it's still a great game. If you haven't bought it, go ahead and buy it, man. It's definitely worth the time. I ended up doing a little bit of knick-knack hunting and stuff, and it was pretty fun for the most part because of the traversal in the game is so fantastic. The traversal in the game in itself makes the knick-knack hunting not feel so monotonous, you know. And I feel like it's only in those games where knick-knack hunting feels like it's just part of the game. It doesn't feel like a separate thing to do. It feels like it's a part of what you are already doing. And it doesn't feel like you're really going out of your way to get it. Everything just feels so closely wrapped up. I guess what it means to be Spider-Man, right? But again, that's my score, man. I give it an 8 out of 10. If you haven't bought it, I highly suggest buying it. If it's on your backlog, I highly suggest sinking your time into it. But those are my overall review on it, man. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. I'm gonna catch y'all on the next video. Peace.